This isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. The Middle Ground Mike is fighting for truth and unity. Subscribe now or support us today. Links are in the notes. Stand with us. All right, everybody, welcome to the Middle Ground Mike. We've got a great guest today. I had a phenomenal pre-show interview with her. Don't think I've ever met someone as much of a student of history as you are. Susan, I really appreciate you coming on. She sat across from Soviets during the Gorbachev-era. She's helped hammer out international security agreements that changed the course of the Cold War. Obviously, historical novelist. Your book, the latest book, I should say, The Communist Secrets, turns a lot of those real-world experiences into gripping fiction about power, the propaganda, and the courage, right?
Right.
Tell everybody a little bit about who you are.
Well, gosh, that's a long answer, but I'll try to shorten it up. I think in college, I decided I wanted to study Russian and political science. And it was because I had grown up during the Cold War, 60s, early 70s. And the threat of nuclear war was kind of a thing back then. It was something we, thought about and sometimes worried about. And so I thought, well, it would make sense to know something about this country, the Soviet Union, right? And so that's why I studied Russian. From there, I went to graduate school, and then I got a fantastic job with the Department of Defense. And there I was actually in a rather small office called European Security Negotiations. And we were really the poor cousins of arms control in the Pentagon. The sexy offices that did the SALT talks and the non-proliferation talks, the nuclear weapons issues, right? Those were the cool offices that got a lot of the attention, especially in the 70s. But we were a very small office. But it turned out that there was a negotiation in the 80s. I started at the Pentagon in 1982, and so in 1984 to 86, there was a 35-nation international conference on something called confidence building measures. And really what we were trying to do is find ways to reduce the risk of war in Europe and increase openness. And the practical things that I negotiated were things like giving advance notification when you have a large military maneuver out in the field, right? So that the Warsaw Pact wouldn't think, oh my gosh, there's this huge 50,000 men out there, not too far away. And so we negotiated those kinds of issues. And so this was at the same time that Mikhail Gorbachev became the last leader of the Soviet Union. And, his push, glasnost, for openness, our work sort of coincided with that in an interesting way. I have a large family. I was a very serious runner for many years, coached high school cross country, have done some other really fun things. And then I became a writer, and I've been writing for about 9 years, and I'm writing a trilogy about Soviet Russia. And I do that because I really think when you read one of my novels, you can draw a line from the 20th century to the 21st century. And I'm very big on democracy. I think it's by far the best form of government. And so I try to show the ways in which dictatorship is not a good form of government in my novels. But they're love stories, they're exciting stories. A lot happens in them. So there you go. There's the short version.
No, and that's great. Talking about, some of those Gorbachev era meetings as we kind of delve into it a little bit, right? And we go down. What's something that, we had kind of talked about earlier off, sometimes the history books aren't always clear. What are something as Americans misunderstood about the Soviets back then, and per se, even how it relates to now?
That's a really, really interesting question. I think we perceived them to be a bigger threat than they really were. I don't think there was any hair trigger. There should have been that kind of fear that, they could push the button at any time. And, we would be forced to respond with nuclear weapons and destroy the world. I actually think that was not I think they were conservative in their views about war with the United States, with NATO, as well as the fact that we were. But there was not much understanding. We did not understand, I think we didn't understand Soviet culture or even their history. For World War II, was really, at least for Vladimir Putin, the current head of Russia, it was the beginning of the apex of Russian power, Soviet power. 1945 to roughly 1980, I would say, the Soviet Union. I mean, their perspective is that Russia defeated Nazi Germany, that they are the reason we are all here today living free, because and they did contribute an enormous amount. I mean, I'm sure many of your listeners don't realize, but the United States and the UK together suffered under 1 million casualties in World War II, and that's both theaters. The Soviets suffered almost 28 million casualties. Yeah, wow is right. 19 million civilians. Every family, everybody in the Soviet Union was impacted by the war. And that has carried forward. World War II is a much bigger part of their history than it is for the US, right? And now what's happened is Putin has taken that and he's put that into his program of nationalism, saying, this was when we were so great. Isn't war great? I mean, he doesn't say, isn't war great? But his whole point is, instead of saying war is horrible, we need to avoid it at all costs, which is what most Americans would say, right? He has raised that up to be this amazing time in Russian history that they defeated Nazi Germany. So it sort of almost normalizes war and conflict. And I think that's part of the reason he doesn't have more or less support domestically, right? People hear that. That's what they've lived through. It's familiar. And, that's why I think there haven't been big protests in Russia against the war in Ukraine. And I'm not saying the Russians, the people, are anywhere near universally supportive of that conflict, but they do. I think it takes them back to that time. That issue of that conflict was just important in terms of Russian greatness. And this is what Putin's so interested in, is rebuilding turning Russia into a great power again.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when you pretty much on that, right? When you were in Moscow, obviously, I'm sure you saw how the Soviet, their government essentially buried truth right under bureaucracy. I mean, a lot of governments do that, but they were pretty much like, yeah, this is what we're doing. At least to me, my perspective. Fast forward to today, it seems like we're seeing the same playbook, obviously out of Putin, and I'm sure out of our government to a degree. I mean, all governments do propaganda, but it just seems to be more open coming from the Russian government than it does anybody else.
Yeah. Well, they have shut down. It's funny. There's two kind of different ways of approaching that whole issue of how you use information, propaganda, how you impact the people and control the people. The West, now with social media, has overwhelmed its own population with information. People don't know what to believe anymore. So that's one tactic. But what Putin does is he has shut down. There is nothing but state-controlled television, nothing but state-controlled radio or the press. There are no independent information outlets that are active in Russia anymore. He's doing all sorts of things to really control the amount of information the average person has access to. One of the best things it's not so little, but it's in the context of what we're talking about, it's little.
Oh, yeah.
Russians have put out a new cell phone, and it's the only one you can buy in Russia now. There's nothing else available. So, and on it is an app, a messaging app called Max. And so you have to get the phone with that app on it. You can't get the phone otherwise. And so people who have other cell phones, which I don't know, but I'm sure there are millions of people there who have other cell phones, who got iPhones, who got other things before the war all started. And they're using WhatsApp and Telegram, and they have access then to friends or family in the West, right? They can call them and say, what is really going on? And all that, right? They can get information. Yeah. But now Putin is shutting down all of that access so that even the really thinking, kind of internationally focused person in Russia is not going to have any way to communicate with anybody in the West, because it's, so Putin's very smart, but control of the information is essential. to any dictatorship, actually, you know. And
Yeah, I mean that's
he's trying very hard to control the information in his country. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Do you think disinformation is the new nuclear weapon? Something that doesn't destroy cities, but it destroys the truth itself.
Yeah, I see it as the biggest crisis, I think, in democracy today. I really do. It's not just in the U.S. I think the U.S. is a little more out of control information wise than some smaller countries, and some of that is the size of the country. I mean, we're a very large country, very diverse, right? Social media, all that, is a little bit bigger and louder and such here. And I do see it as a serious problem. I think, even well-educated people, sometimes it's hard to find the truth. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of reading. It takes a lot of, scrolling. It is difficult. And I think that is a very serious problem. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when we all knew what the truth was. I mean, I don't know, 10, 15 years. I mean, not that long ago. And now it's really different now.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously studied the Russian society up close. How do ordinary people there, like, because, what we think is authoritarian here, and most people around the world, and I probably see the vast majority of countries be like, what are you talking about? That's like open. But, how do ordinary people in those societies, how do they adapt to living in systems built on, the control and that level of secrecy? Like, how did you see that?
I see it. It's funny. It's like the thing about, what is it? You put a frog in a boiling pot of water or something and into cold water, right? And it's fine. And then you turn up the temperature and it will die, right? It won't jump out or whatever. And it's a little bit, that's exactly kind of what Putin has been doing to his people. Because when he started in 2000, the country wasn't, fully democratic in terms of everything, but there was, they had, they still have a constitution and, houses of government and elections. But slowly, he just like turning up the heat just a little bit every year, bringing things under his control. A lot of damage has been done before people really are like, wait a minute, what is going on? I mean, you start having all kinds of people in former positions of power, whether they're journalists or even a lot of oligarchs, they're just disappeared, right? They're just murdered by the system. And, Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, is probably the biggest name that many of us in the West know, but there are many, many others besides Navalny who have simply been, imprisoned, executed, otherwise silenced. So I mean, I haven't been in Russia in a long time. I mean, I was there in 2017, but I was doing research for a book. And I mean, I did talk to many locals, but, actually not that much about these kinds of questions about their freedom. And so, but I see it as he is very, very smart. And he has, used the system to his advantage entirely.
That's just,
It's very,
I guess it's crazy,
it's so depressing.
It's
I
like,
mean, I think many people think eventually, people will rebel. People will not tolerate that anymore. And I don't know if that will come when he dies or, and then there has to be a change. I don't know that there always are candidates to take his place, but I don't know if the effectiveness would continue. People are very tired of the corruption in Russian society. I will say that. And it's quite well known and, across, I think, all aspects of society that the corruption is really, really rampant. And that goes actually back to the 90s when, the country fell. It just literally, people went to bed one night in a communist country and woke up the next day in a non-communist country, I mean, it was just, and people everyone had a job from the state. They had a place to live from the state. And all of a sudden, all that was opened up. It was really chaos. And there wasn't enough food. There was not, I mean, the 90s were a really difficult time in Russia. And Putin didn't do is he didn't get rid of all the corruption. He could have done a better job of that. He could have. And also economically, he took the easy route and has, built this oil and gas powerhouse, and he's not built that much of the rest of his economy. People think Russia is so powerful. The Russian economy, Russia is a population of about, I think, 145 million. Canada has 40 million. So, less than a third. And the Canadian economy is bigger than the Russian economy. Yeah. I mean, not by a lot, but on the list of countries, Russia's like 11th or 12th, and Canada's, 1 or 2 above them. And I do think those issues are going to eventually create some instability in the country. But we shall see. A lot of Russians fled when they attacked Ukraine. A lot of the smartest, wealthiest left the country, over 1 million. Yeah. So
the brain drain.
The brain drain. That's it. Exactly. The brain drain. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously it's incredible. The double think, right? It's not fiction anymore necessarily.
No, it's not.
Some of the things that I always thought was ironic, right? The Soviet Union spent 25%, I got my talk boy, of its GDP by the mid 1980s on military. Their defense spending in Russia is only, I think it's 8% now. And that is just, when you compare both, it's when you kind of take that, you take the media, floating it out there, right? That really makes Russia seem a whole lot smaller and not as, if you took nuclear weapons out of Russia, would they even be relevant, right?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think they would not be all that relevant. And I think Putin knows that, that's what he's fighting against. He wants Russia to be relevant, right? He wants it to have power and influence. He wants to be able to intimidate countries for whatever his purposes might be.
Let's take a quick break.
The Middle Ground, Mike, isn't just another podcast. It's a movement for unity, for truth, for a future beyond the left and the right. But movements don't grow without people willing to stand up. Subscribe now on Buzzsprout. Fuel this mission directly on PayPal. Every subscription keeps the fire burning. The links are in the show notes. Be more than a listener. Be part of the Middle Ground. Are you seeing a lot of parallels between Russia now and towards the end of the Soviet? Not like the Russian government's going to fall, but because how, Putin seems to be losing grips on certain parts of what, his end game was, right? Are you seeing certain parallels between them? Between the two?
That's an interesting question, but I would say I haven't given it that much thought, and I don't really see it the same way, because in the late Soviet Union, there was no cult of personality like you had with Stalin, for example. And to me, what Putin is doing is re-Stalinizing Russia. He is, in practical ways, he's putting up monuments to Stalin, putting him on posters. He argues that, listen, Stalin was the leader who led us to the great victory over Nazi Germany. So he is, re-Stalinizing the country in a lot of ways. And that, I do think there is some similarity there. But I think, in the 70s and 80s, I think the Soviet people had, too many generations had gone by under communism, under the Soviet system, under Soviet socialism. And so it was a different situation than now. I think now it could be definitely more volatile because the people do know what's happened in the rest of the world, right? And they are frustrated, some of them, by their lack of opportunities. Once, not that long ago, Russians could travel anywhere they wanted, right? They could. Even in the early years of Putin, there was no, if you wanted to take a trip to wherever you did, those things are changing, right?
Yeah, no, big time.
Yeah, as they lose opportunities, as such, they lose freedoms. Yeah, the people, they've felt what freedom could bring and some of the bad of it too. And the Russian version of freedom is also It's not necessarily economic freedom, but I still think I think it's quite different than it was. I think there was a lot more. I think it's less likely to be complacent here now when things really start to turn in Russia. Whereas I think in the, in the 80s, I mean, in 1980, nobody was thinking the Soviet Union might fall. Oh, in 1985, no one was thinking the Soviet
No.
Union would collapse.
It happened real fast.
Right. It happened really, really fast. I don't know. It's interesting to think how it might happen now, but I really don't know.
Yeah, as we talk about that, so the freedom houses, and I was thinking, because one of the lines on your site is dictatorship destroys freedom, justice, equality. So here's I don't know if you know this stat. This was, like I said, I'm always looking at this and sometimes just blown away. The Freedom House has reported 52 countries now as authoritarian or hybrid regimes, the highest number since the early 1990s. It seems that, when you look at like democracies to a point, especially in smaller, they're in retreat and people are going more towards, I don't necessarily see it like a rise in communism, but definitely a rise in authoritarianism to help solve the problems where some people feel like they're being left.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, democracies are the most inefficient form of government. Democracy is difficult. It really is difficult to do. I mean, it's a lot easier to have a small group in power or a person, right? Decide everything and say, we're going this route economically, we're doing this or whatever. But I think it's simply that it's difficult. It is difficult to have a democracy. You have you have to have people who are willing to talk to each other. You have to have, I mean, I haven't looked at Freedom House's rankings in a while, but I did at least a couple of years ago. And yeah, it is not good, the direction, I think, of the world.
No,
So,
I mean, you once said, fiction can reveal truths, but it can reveal truths, facts can't. I completely 1,000% agree with that. Especially with, if you say the sun's bright today, Lord knows that could break out into political like war, right? Just because that's how polarized people have become. In your storytelling, we were kind of talking about at the beginning about how your book kind of flows. Like, what truth are you hoping people can walk away with?
yeah. Well, I really want my readers to come to the conclusion that freedom is critical for humans to be able to realize who they are and what they can become and to have the opportunity to pursue that. I just think human life is very valuable. Every person in the world, right, has skills and abilities and interests and stuff. And I just think people should be allowed to do that. So my books tell stories of the World War II, and they are stories that are actually really kind of uplifting in a way. So the first novel, real quickly, is called Lost Souls of Leningrad, and it's set in former Leningrad. Most people don't know this bit of World War II history, but history buffs do know that the Germans blockaded the city of Leningrad in 1941. And for 2.5 years, they had the city cut off from the entire world. And they starved over 1 million civilians to death during this siege, this blockade. It's the greatest, really, civilian tragedy in wartime history. Yeah, really, really horrible event. And it's hardly ever written about because it's so grim. And so I really wanted to write a book about it. Actually, when I was a student in Moscow, we went to Leningrad for a few days, and they took us to the Piskarevskaya Cemetery, which is a memorial cemetery to those who died during the siege. And there are almost 500,000 unknowns, mass graves, huge mass graves that look like raised beds. I mean, just to think, whole families just vanished from the face of the earth. No one left to remember them. Anyway, I was 21 years old, and it was a really moving couple of hours for me. And so when I did decide to write, I knew I wanted to write about that episode. And this was 40 years later, but I knew I wanted to write about it. And What I did in it is I have 4 protagonists, so 4 main characters, a grandmother and granddaughter who are trapped in the city, and the men they love are on the outside. And what the book does is it touches on all sorts of things that happened during the siege, not just the starvation, not just the cold, not all just the horrible things, but the uplifting things, like the administrator of the state library, which is in central St. Petersburg today, then central Leningrad. She kept it open during the siege every day. It was open. People came in and sat around, got so small they had no electricity. They just sat around one little table with candles, but it uplifted those few people who came in every day. 39 of the schools stayed open during the siege. And that gave children a place to go besides sitting at home in a freezing cold apartment where there's nothing to eat. It gave them some sense of normalcy, right? So there were all kinds of things that went on during the siege that were really, really uplifting things. Yeah, I had a friend who said it's a war story where compassion is the unsung hero. So
I mean, that's a really good way of putting it, actually.
yeah.
When you kind of think about it like that.
Yeah. And then my second book, what the second book, so it's become a trilogy. So that grandmother and granddaughter, the woman in between them, the communist secret is her story during the war. And she ends up in occupied Russia, in occupied territory under German jurisdiction. And I kind of wanted to write about occupation because huge sections of the former Soviet Union were occupied by Nazi Germany during the war. And no one ever writes about it. You never hear.
I didn't really think about it. I mean,
yeah.
Heard about it, but I never really thought about it until you
Yeah.
just said it, you know?
I mean, yeah, mostly we know about Stalingrad because that was the big battle that
Right.
saved the world, kind of. But I wanted to write a little bit about something about occupation and also to include something about partisans. A lot has been written about partisan forces in Europe and Italy and France and everywhere, right? But not much about in Russia. And I wanted to cover a little bit of that. So this is really, she's a complicated character. She's not, she's a selfish woman, actually, who's done some not such great things in her life. And going through the war helps her come to terms with her own failings and with the failings of her government. So that's the communist secret. And you don't have to have read one. They stand alone completely. So anyway.
No, I mean, so like I find that fascinating, right? Like, so when you kind of think about it, right, you think about those not so good things, right? And then you think about like how, back then, obviously arms control, but it seems like a lot of that today are economic systems, what they're using as cyber networks, data. What does, from your perspective and relating that to your book, right? What does arms control and something like that look like in today's age?
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about where we're going to go in that direction, if we're going to go in that direction. But I think, it's really complicated now with China and even, with North Korea. I mean, the old phrase was the genie's out of the bottle with nuclear weapons, right? And now I actually don't know how I do think, I was going to say, I don't know how we negotiate on those things. I think détente, which is, of course, a word from the Cold War era, actually still does apply today because except you have many more countries, nuclear powers, who you need some kind of détente, right? You're not going to use nuclear weapons unless someone uses them on you. And it would be interesting to see if that kind of a treaty could be negotiated. I doubt it. And I don't think it's necessarily just Russia and the United States. I think has to do with smaller, more difficult actors.
Yeah, they got a lot more to lose by giving that power up.
Right. So,
and it's about more for them. It's about power and the ability to have a negotiating stance.
Right. That's right. It's about having a seat at the table, right? Having a voice in things and being taken seriously, But yeah, so
that's what drives a lot of those countries to go that route,
That's right. That's right. It's not, they really think they're going to get attacked by a nuclear weapon. Does North Korea really think that? No, they want that because they want to threaten South Korea. They want to threaten.
They want to flex their muscles.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's that's kind of like, like what we do on like this show, right? We try to like get around the polarization, those kind of things, and try to find like that, where is it all like because it's easy to sit there and go, okay, it's ABC, right? But where's like the perspective? To me, perspective is like almost as important as the fact itself. Because I tell people truth is really how you perceive it. Like, so I'm in business, right? And so when I teach, what I always tell people is it's my job to teach you, because if I assume that you think that the pen is blue, but you don't, we're both wrong. And everybody's going to convince it's a different color. So it's my job to get everybody to believe that that pen is blue. That's what we have to do, right? So it's like that unifying, like finding, okay, how do we balance that? And a lot of places don't anymore. I mean, that's just in general, like that's kind of just like more of a metaphor of what I use.
Right.
And people don't, they're always like, oh, it's got to be this. I'm like, no, it's just, we just got to peel things back, look at it from a balanced perspective, right? Like, don't be afraid to challenge your own narratives, right?
Right.
And it seems like people are afraid to do that now.
Yeah, and it's very true with Russia today and with our relationship with Russia. I mean, I think, a lot of the people making decisions in our country do not understand Putin's sense of grievance. He is really motivated not just by his ambition to be the leader of a great nation, but by his grievance, which is deep down in him, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest disaster in modern history. I mean, that's how he views it. And so he has this real, and of course, many of those nations that then became independent, they turned to the West. They turned to NATO and said, can we join? We need protection, right? And of course they did.
Right.
They'd been, part of the Soviet Union for 70 years in many cases, right? They were under the Soviet thumb and they were fearful. And so Putin has this tremendous grievance over the fall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also over what happened in the years immediately following, when so many of those countries, joined NATO. And of course, that's part of the issue with Ukraine as well, as Ukraine would like to move that direction and join the EU and eventually join NATO. And, Putin's perspective is, it's very difficult to argue with. I mean, I think, certainly he's been told, certainly he's read, certainly he's heard that, the US and NATO aren't trying to push him in a corner. But what he tells his people is that that's exactly what's going on, is that NATO and the West, the United States, are trying to push us in a corner and deprive us of our rightful place in the world.
Does he truly believe that, though? That's the question.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, whether he really believes it or it's a really convenient argument in his big push for nationalism and to convince the people that, hey, we're going to be great again. And so I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't know Putin. I don't,
Yeah, no.
But, I mean, even having read a lot about him, I feel like there are a lot of things I don't really know, and I always say to myself, he must not really think that. but
You would
it's
hope so.
Yeah, but it's so convenient,
Yes, it is.
It's so convenient. It's such a convenient argument for him to make. And he makes it over and over and over again domestically. And, a lot of people do believe it. I had one interesting experience. I had a couple talking to people the last time I was in Russia. This was just a person on the street, and I was with my just one of my children at this time, and a man standing on the street overheard us speak English, and he said, "Where are you from?" And I told him we were from the United States, and he says, "Such a terrible country. He just attacked the US to my face." Right? And I tried to actually engage him and say, what are you, but he had this sense of grievance and hatred. And for a long time, I just thought it's just, nothing. But now more and more, I feel like this is part of what Putin has actually done to his country, is to turn them, into, yeah, we hate the West kind of thing. So
I mean,
I don't
that's just seems to be his motto these days.
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
So, if there was one Cold War myth you wish people would stop believing? What is
That is a really, really tough question. I think it would probably come from the 60s when we in the US felt that the risk of nuclear war was really serious and the Soviets were going to attack if we gave them an opportunity. And I think I just think that's a myth. I don't think it's true, you know. And there was evidence of that, right? You had the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Trying to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. I mean,
Yeah, that was
why are you doing that if you're not going to attack? And I still don't think, I think it was just a muscle flexing thing again. But
right, most definitely.
yeah.
Which author, past or present, most shaped kind of your understanding of truth and power?
My goodness. Wow. I don't have just one, but I will say that I think the best historical novel written about World War II is written by a name named Hans Fallada, a German. It is not a book. It is a book very little known in the United States called Every Man Dies Alone. And it is a brilliant expose of what happened to German society and relationships among Germans that kind of allowed the war to happen, although it only takes place. The war has started already at the beginning, but it's a fascinating book. And it's also a fascinating book of bravery and opposing such a system.
That must have been tricky.
Oh, yeah.
Considering they had an iron
I
grip.
will say the main characters were executed by the Nazis in the end. So it was not a happy ending, but it was a brilliant story of bravery and opposing something is really wrong. And so, yeah, I always hold that story dear. That's on my 10 best books of all time shelf. So,
Hey, you can't beat that. If you could brief today's negotiators on your knowledge of past, present, middle history, whatever you want to call it, working on the Ukraine situation, right? What's one piece of advice you'd give them that the public maybe doesn't realize that they should know?
first of all, I just want to say that there are dozens of people much smarter than me out there to give that information. But what I would say is less talk and more weaponry. I would say talking with Putin, I don't see it working. And I think we have to really step up the pressure. And there are only two forms of pressure. One is military. It's true he doesn't care how many men he loses, but eventually there comes a tipping point where he would care. And also economically, and that's why I think taking that $300 billion in frozen Russian assets, giving it to Ukraine so that they can purchase many of the weapons they need. They don't have to have them donated or, given by the US or other countries. And I think economically also, that's why I love the idea of instead of, coming down on India with high tariffs, play nice to India and say, listen, this is what we want in return. We want you to cut your oil and gas imports from Russia. India is a very large importer of Russian oil and gas, and we could offer them favorable tariff rates or something as a carrot and get them to help that way. We could do the same with Turkey. Turkey's a NATO member and they have huge amounts of oil and gas that they import from Russia. I think we can do things economically. I think it's hard to do, but I always think Trump prides himself on negotiating, right? So why doesn't he do a couple of these negotiations with friends countries that are friendly, that he can maybe, turn up the heat on Russia a little bit.
We definitely need to.
Yeah, we do.
If there's a diplomatic skill that you learned at the Pentagon, what is one of those skills that the average American could use in everyday life?
Well, I do think a lot of people do this, but it is think before you talk.
Yes.
It is, as a negotiator, that's kind of critical. And you can tell I like to talk. And so that actually was something I had to pay attention to as a negotiator. I had to not immediately say what I was thinking, but think about it and figure out, exactly when and where I should be talking about things.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely hard. I mean, I learned that myself, in my younger days, and got pulled into a couple meetings. Oh, you can't say it like that. You can address it. You just can't say it like that. And it's like, oh, okay, because in my head, I grew up with my dad, obviously, being German background, he's was just everything was pretty just cut and dry. Like it was to the point. Feelings weren't a factor as much, and so I just, I didn't take necessarily that approach, but it was a lot more directed. That did not go over so well with a lot of people, so I had to learn to be a little bit more diplomatic, learn to try to see the other person's side of it. And that's hard for a lot of people to do, no matter who you are, because in your mind, you just can't fathom it. That's, the world is a crazy place.
Yeah, but people should be a little more considered in their speech in general, right?
Yes.
Especially, I
Yes.
mean, a lot, especially politicians. And I feel that's a serious problem here, is that we don't have that kind of gravitas given to diplomatic speech, being, thinking before you say things.
Yeah, that would be
So
nice.
it
You
would be nice.
know, let's end here on some hope, right? Global, you've seen global tensions firsthand. You've chronicled them obviously through your writing. You know, what keeps you optimistic?
Truthfully, I'm not optimistic right now. And this is the first time really in my life I haven't been optimistic. I am very concerned because I do feel that the White House does not understand Putin. And Trump has not brought in, it was different in the first administration. He had brought in advisors, cabinet members, others who did have expertise. John Bolton comes to mind. And this time, not so much. And I feel that that's a real reason for concern. Because if he doesn't have advisors telling him, listen, Putin is this, this, and this, then what he does, I think, Trump, is he puts his own kind of perspective onto Putin. And if Putin doesn't think the way he does, or any of us do. So I am not, I mean, I do think, Americans are very resilient. And I do think that over the course of, 10 or 15 years, things will come around and, perhaps we will be in a stronger democracy where everybody has a voice, not where just one party has a voice, right? I mean, I want to believe that is the case. I think, that's something to really strive for. And our government has operated that way in the past, sometimes better than others, sure. But right now it's become so bipartisan. If you can't work with the people representing half of America, that's a problem. I mean, you can jam your perspective through when you're in the majority, but that's not the best thing for the country, right?
Right?
The
You gotta be
best
able to
thing is
balance it.
that, yeah, everybody has to have a voice and feel that their ideas and thoughts and concerns are represented. So I hope that will happen. I think it will take at least a decade to get there, but maybe I'd love to be proved wrong.
Right? No, but what keeps me hopeful, is people are able to come and have conversations like this, right? Like certain mediums, it's starting to become okay, and that's the one thing that digs deeper to me than memes or headlines. That's what matters. And you see pockets of that popping up, or I see a lot more of it in like the podcasting world than you do like your big brands. And I think that's why podcasting has exploded,
Yeah.
because it's, you don't, things aren't geared towards what your advertiser wants as much. I mean, I'm sure it is in certain, shows that have, certain, a lot more money behind them. But, to me, that is hope, right? Because it shows that there is a section out there, and podcasting is, I mean, it's getting to be a bigger industry. Growth has definitely dipped a little bit post COVID, but now it's back on the upswing. Uh, so that's where we go. But to everybody listening, go to SuzanneParryWrites.com. It'll be in the notes about the bottom of here. Pick up The Communist Secret. Like Susan said, it's more than a novel. It's a reminder of how fragile truth really is. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter here, everybody. And remember, real change doesn't come from shouting louder. It comes from listening harder. And that's why here we always say no left, no right, just forward. Susan, I thank you for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you. Really glad
All
to
right.
have been here, Joe. Really
All right.
appreciate the opportunity.
I appreciate it. Thank you.